Underemployment is the least talked about, most powerful thing in our economy. More people are working harder than they ever have. I'll tell you what it means. And look, that's part of the problem.
I don't know what that is. What's underemployment?
Bill O'Reilly recently sat down with Chris Cuomo for a discussion that touched on the economy, employment, socialism, Mondani, and several other political issues, and it did not take long for the conversation to become pretty contentious. As the exchange unfolded, O'Reilly made a number of strong claims about the economy and government policy, but some of those claims raised serious questions about how well they were actually supported. There was one particular moment that really stood out, when O'Reilly admitted that he did not know what underemployment meant, despite spending much of the conversation talking about jobs and the state of the economy. That moment deserves a closer look, but it was far from the only interesting part of this debate. There are several other points where Cuomo challenged O'Reilly's arguments, and some of the responses from both sides reveal quite a bit about how they view the economy, government, and the problems facing ordinary Americans. So rather than just looking at one viral moment, let's go through this exchange and break down what was actually being said, where the arguments fell apart, and what I think each side got right or wrong.
It's why so many Americans are desperate. They believe the government won't help. That's why they're looking for outsiders. But you don't need a rap sheet to be righteous. You don't have to make a deal with the devil to appeal to people who are desperate for change, because for them, the real devil is in the details of their daily existence. Now, I want to bring Bill O'Reilly in and see how he sees this economy playing out in the midterms. Do you think that this is going to be the main motivational issue come November?
Yes, I think it will be, although the communism thing is rapidly obscuring the day-to-day spending habits of Americans. So the communist thing is very detrimental to the Democratic Party. But
what is the communist thing?
This. Hello, are you on the planet Earth, ma'am Donnie?
Yeah, but I mean, just because Trump calls people...
Let's start with the label Bill O'Reilly puts on Mondani, because that is where this discussion immediately goes off track. O'Reilly repeatedly describes him as a communist, but disagreeing with someone's economic proposals does not automatically turn that person into a communist. Those are political terms with specific meanings, and if you are going to use one as a major part of your argument, you should at least be able to explain why it actually applies. There is a huge difference between criticizing someone's approach to government spending, social programs, or the economy and simply attaching the most extreme label you can think of. A serious conversation requires more than that. You have to look at what the person actually believes, what policies they support, and what they have consistently argued for before making a sweeping judgment about their ideology. Otherwise, you are not really debating the substance of their ideas at all. You are just putting a label on them and using that label as a substitute for an argument, and that is exactly why O'Reilly's characterization deserves to be challenged.
Communist doesn't mean that it's resonating.
Okay, if you study the man, he's a communist, so is his father. All right, he wants to control the means of production in New York City. He's going to use regulations to get landlords out of business. He's going to try to control the food flow into the city. So you can sit there and say, I don't believe it. People believe what they want to believe. Man's a hardcore communist. And so are the two others who were...
Listen, my brother ran against him, right, and lost twice. The policies he's put in place are barely socialistic, let alone not communistic. And here's what I don't get about the communist thing. One, there is no such thing as a communist country, okay? There is none that is technically communist. You got North Korea, you got Russia, you got China. And the weird thing about those places, the only semblance of affinity I've ever seen is that Trump respects all three leaders. Trump thinks that Kim is a strong leader, Putin's a strong leader, and Xi is a strong leader. He's the only guy who said anything positive about communism.
That goes day by day because he wants to get a deal with those people. Cuba is probably the best example of a communist country where you cannot do anything without permission of the government. So look, we're not going to solve this. I believe that Mondani is a communist. You don't freeze rents across the board unless you want to control where people live. You just don't. Now, the affordability thing. So Trump's point of view is this. Okay, it's tight times for many Americans, but there's only so much the federal government can do about that. And I brought this up with Vetter last night. If you have $1,000 and that's all you have, okay, for a medical emergency or your kid's in trouble or whatever it may be, if you have a grant and you've been working, 10, 15 years someplace, whose fault is that? That's your fault, okay? Because there is a way to accumulate assets in this country that's called capitalism. All right, you accumulate them. And then I give the example, and I think you would buy into this because your neighborhood was fairly close to my neighborhood in New York. Since I'm 10 years old, I worked. And my father, and one of the pieces of advice he gave me, probably the only one I ever took, was every time you get a paycheck, you save 10% of it. And then you buy into the capitalistic system, buy stocks and bonds. And I have done that. And the stock market, as everybody knows, has enriched a lot of people. Now, 58% of Americans have stock, the rest don't. But again, whose fault is that? So I'm not sure the affordability crisis is the right way to frame this. But I will cede to you that it is an emotional issue, that it's real, people are suffering, and that's not going to help the Republican Party. It will not. But if you want to build assets in this country, you can build them. But if you sit on your butt doing nothing, you can't.
Yeah, I think, look, Bill, I think that's where the road diverges, okay? There's no question that America at its best is a land of opportunity, and if you bust your ass, you can live your own personal dream. However, it has gotten way too hard. Underemployment is the least talked about, most powerful thing in our economy. More people are working harder than they ever have. I'll tell you what it means. And look, that's part of the problem.
I don't know what that is. What's underemployment?
Now this is where the whole discussion gets especially interesting. O'Reilly spends the conversation speaking with a great deal of certainty, but then we reach a basic economic term that you would expect anyone debating jobs in the economy to understand, and he admits that he does not know what underemployment means. That is a pretty remarkable moment, especially considering how confidently he presents himself as someone with a deep understanding of history and public affairs. And the irony becomes even stronger because later on, O'Reilly turns around and questions Chris Cuomo's knowledge of history, essentially positioning himself as the person who understands these subjects better. That creates a pretty obvious problem. You cannot spend your time questioning another person's knowledge while openly acknowledging that you are unfamiliar with a basic concept directly connected to the discussion you are having. Nobody expects a commentator to know everything, but there is a difference between admitting you do not know something and speaking with absolute certainty while criticizing everyone else for supposedly being uninformed. In this case, O'Reilly's confidence is what makes the moment stand out so much. The issue is not simply that he did not know one particular term. It is the fact that his certainty throughout the conversation makes that admission far more revealing. And when you combine that with the way he later lectures Cuomo about history and knowledge, the contradiction becomes difficult to ignore. So with that in mind, let's move on to the next part of this exchange.
Underemployment. Unemployment is who has a job. Underemployment is how good is the job. And more Americans are working more hours for less, working multiple jobs, and they are not getting the wage growth to keep up with prices, so they can't save.
Then why don't they do something? Why don't they do something about it? So community college is free across the board.
They're working more than ever. They don't have time to go to community college.
Community college is not universally free, and what students actually pay can differ significantly based on where they live, which college they attend, what program they choose, and their own financial circumstances.
Okay.
They're working multiple jobs. When you and I grew up in Queens, Bill, one middle-class income was enough for a whole family and a pace for home ownership. Now you got both parents working and sometimes one of the kids.
It's a different time now, okay? So community college is free across the board.
And then we get to the claim about community college, because this is another point where the reality is a lot more complicated than Bill O'Reilly makes it sound. Community college is not automatically free for every student in every part of the country. What someone pays can depend on their state, the specific school, the program they are enrolled in, available financial aid, and their own financial circumstances. I can see this for myself because there is a community college roughly a mile from where I live, and students there are not simply walking through the doors and receiving a completely free education. they still have tuition and other costs to deal with, which makes the idea that all community colleges across America are already tuition-free completely misleading. And this matters because making higher education more affordable is a real policy debate, especially for working families who are already struggling with rising costs everywhere else. Instead of pretending the problem does not exist, we should be talking honestly about why college has become so expensive and what can actually be done to make education more accessible. You can disagree with tuition-free college as a policy, but that is very different from pretending the current system is already free for everyone.
Okay, maybe you want to figure out a better job. Get more skills. Just driving an Uber in New York City, you can pile up some serious cash. Just driving an automobile, okay? So I don't know what this underemployment is. I worked at jobs where I wasn't fairly paid, okay? And I got another job because I knew I was getting hosed. Now, one caveat to this. Insurance companies, healthcare companies, airline companies, oil companies are all gouging the American people right now. They are using capitalism. Look, the airline industry, their jet fuel costs have dropped significantly, but not their ticket prices. They spend billions of dollars telling you to buy State Farm, paying these people exorbitant amounts of money, and then you, a good client, okay, no accidents, no fires in the house, get a premium renewal that's up 30% with no explanation.
Now you're getting it.
No, I've always gotten it, Cuomo, but I'm not a black and white kind of guy. If I'm in a circumstance where I'm underemployed, then I get more credentials to...
What really stands out about O'Reilly's approach here is how quickly he turns a complicated political question into a simple label. He hears an argument he disagrees with, declares that Mondani is a communist, and seems to consider the matter settled right there. There is no real attempt to explain what specific beliefs make that label appropriate, no serious consideration of the possibility that Mondani's views might fall somewhere else on the political spectrum, and no willingness to engage with the actual policies being discussed. It becomes a very simple equation: I disagree with this person, therefore this is what he must be. That is exactly the kind of rigid, black and white thinking that makes political debates go nowhere. The strange part is that O'Reilly then speaks as though everyone else is failing to understand the issue, when he is the one reducing a complicated subject to a single accusation without much explanation behind it. You can strongly disagree with someone's economic ideas without pretending there is only one possible interpretation of their political position. At some point, confidence stops being persuasive when there is no real argument underneath it, and that is exactly what makes this moment so frustrating to watch.
And you can do that here. Mondani ain't gonna save you. He'll make your life worse.
I think that if the Republican Party argues in the midterms that the reason times are tough is because you're not doing enough to help yourself, they're going to have an epic defeat because people are working harder than ever, and the system has made it harder than it ever has been before. And it's about the choices. You just named some of the good fixes. There's some fixes to be had.
History proves you wrong. The Great Depression was far and away, okay, the most onerous economic thing that's ever happened. So you can't make that comparison at all. But if the Republicans go out and say, hey, Clyde, the reason you don't have any money is because you're not smart enough to figure out the system and make more, you're right. Clyde ain't going to vote for you. But that is the truth.
Especially when a lot of those people were MAGA.
Parties.
And let me tell you something about that.
I don't care who they are.
Great Depression. Let me tell you about the Great Depression. Let me tell you what the big difference was. How did we get out of the Great Depression? Yes. Federal government action.
World War II. No.
Federal government action.
It was a war that got us out. It was a
war that was a catalyst to the economy after the war. And let me tell you, if you study Truman,
after the war. After the war. It was during the build-up to World War II that the economy turned around in this country. Fact.
Well, that is true, because that was the New Deal. The New Deal absolutely helped people get out from under it. I know my family was among them. The New Deal from FDR helped people get out of the Great Depressions, Bill. That's what it is, not an opinion.
I'm coming to your house and tutoring you on history because you badly need it. The New Deal was a safety net process. Okay. It wasn't underemployment. It wasn't giving people free stuff. It was a safety net.
Yes, and that has been eroded.
So I don't know if Chris Cuomo has Bill O'Reilly on his show all the time just so
There is something interesting about the way Chris Cuomo approaches these conversations with Bill O'Reilly, because I honestly cannot tell whether Cuomo sees this as a genuine battle of ideas or whether he knows that O'Reilly is going to create plenty of opportunities for him to push back. Either way, the difference in how they approach some of these issues becomes pretty obvious. O'Reilly speaks with enormous confidence, but confidence alone does not make an argument correct. To be fair, I do think he raised a few legitimate concerns, particularly when he talked about Americans being hit with higher costs from major industries like oil, airlines, and insurance. People are absolutely feeling pressure from rising expenses, whether we are talking about property coverage, car insurance, transportation, or energy. But identifying a problem is only the first step. The question I would put to O'Reilly is what he actually wants done about it. If a company is taking advantage of consumers and charging unreasonable prices, what mechanism do you support for stopping that behavior? Because corporations are not going to suddenly become charitable organizations. If you want meaningful limits on abusive practices, you need some combination of oversight, consumer protections, regulation, or laws that create real consequences. That creates an obvious tension in O'Reilly's argument. He can criticize corporations for hurting consumers, but if every attempt by the government to regulate those corporations is dismissed as communist or socialist, then what exactly is the alternative? You cannot identify a serious problem and then reject every practical tool that could be used to address it. That is where the argument needs more than political labels. It needs an actual solution. Cuomo's discussion of the New Deal also deserves attention because the history of American government is not nearly as simple as saying that government programs are inherently bad. The New Deal era brought major changes to the American economy and helped establish programs that became part of the country's social and economic structure. Social Security and the GI Bill are two obvious examples of policies that helped millions of Americans gain greater financial security, pursue education, buy homes, and build more stable lives. Later programs and institutions also became important parts of the American safety net. You can debate how these programs should operate today, but pretending they had no meaningful impact on American families completely ignores history. The same thing applies to the argument over college. Public higher education in California has a complicated history, and there was a time when tuition was not the financial burden it eventually became. The system changed over time, including during Ronald Reagan's period as governor, and that history is important when discussing whether affordable public education is some impossible fantasy. It is not. There are legitimate arguments on both sides of the question of how college should be funded, but reducing the entire issue to a simple attack on free education does not tell the full story. And that is really the bigger problem I see throughout this exchange. O'Reilly often presents complicated economic and historical questions as though they have extremely simple answers, while Cuomo keeps forcing the discussion back toward the details. That does not mean Cuomo is automatically right about everything, but it does make the debate more interesting when someone is willing to challenge broad claims instead of letting them slide. Then we get to the underemployment moment, and that is where the conversation takes an especially strange turn. After spending so much time discussing jobs and the economy, O'Reilly admits that he does not know what the term underemployment means. That is not something I would treat as proof that someone knows nothing, because nobody knows every technical term, but when you combine that admission with the confidence he has displayed throughout the discussion, it becomes a pretty memorable moment. It raises the question of whether the certainty we are hearing is always matched by the knowledge behind it. So now I want to know what you think. Was Cuomo actually stronger during this exchange, or did O'Reilly make points that deserve more credit? Did either one of them really answer the economic questions they were discussing, or did the conversation turn into another political shouting match? Let me know where you stand in the comments, and if you enjoyed the commentary, make sure to like the video and subscribe.